Hello, and welcome to my channel. I will be mostly reading stories and experiences from the Canada Sasquatch Map, which I will put in the description below. Not all my videos will be Sasquatch stories, however, because I'll also be delving into the other unknown entities and the paranormal. Leave your suggestions in the comments on what other types of stories you'd like to hear. Feedback would be very appreciated. This story comes to you from Pitt Lake in BC. In the late 1960s, myself and a few other commercial fishermen and old hand loggers went to visit Oscar Greenland, now deceased, a longtime hand logger and permanent resident of Pitt Lake. Oscar seemed to enjoy our visits, as we always brought a bottle of his favorite gin and some type of a treat for his faithful old dog. Sometimes during the long hours of BS sessions, the subject of Sasquatch was injected into the noisy conversation. Oscar told us about a time some years back when he was headed up the lake towards home at first light on a beautiful summer morning. He went on to explain that the lake was flat as glass and there wasn't a breath of wind. As they were heading from point to point, he happened to glance towards the shoreline and noticed a rhythmic splashing about 300 yards away. Out of curiosity, he decided to head his old East Hope-powered ex-gill netter towards the beach in case someone was in trouble. As he got closer, he noticed a downed alder or cottonwood tree laying in the water with what appeared to be a huge dark-colored man-ape jumping up and down on it, looking for all the world like it was simply playing and totally amused by the splashes it was making in the water. Oscar went on to explain that once the ape-like creature spotted him getting closer, it went up the tree faster than any man could have possibly gone and quickly disappeared into the bush. Old Oscar then asked us at all if we thought there were any grizzly bears in the Pitt Lake country. While none of us had ever seen or heard of a grizzly bear down low in this general neck of woods, we asked him why he inquired. Oscar said that one day he was up behind the cabin cutting shake blocks when his dog suddenly began to growl, bark, and generally go crazy. Oscar said he stared in the direction of the dog's gaze and saw what he thought was about an 8-foot-tall grizzly standing on its hind legs, partially hidden behind some alders. Oscar went on to say that he'd heard plenty of bears grunt and cougars scream in his days in the bush, but he had never heard such a tremendously loud roar come out of any animal he knew of. This is another story from Pitt Lake, also in the 1960s. About mid-August 1960, I was asked by a good friend Barry to go on a 2 or 3 day camping trip to Pitt Lake. Barry's dad, Vince Sr., had arranged a boat ride to an isolated beach at the mouth of Debec Creek with his brother Joe, who at the time owned and operated several big logging operations in the Pitt Lake region. Joe picked us up at Pitt Lake Boat Launch after dropping off his logging crew at camp early one morning, and we traveled by speedboat north up Pitt Lake about 15 kilometers. Joe dropped us and our gear off on the beach at the mouth of Debec Creek with a promise to keep an eye out for us when he passed by each morning. Since the weather was warm and clear, it was decided no tent was required, and we would sleep in our bags and blankets under the stars. Vince Sr. and young Terry picked a beautiful flat spot on the pea gravel beach right near the mouth of Debec Creek to camp. Barry and I decided that we wanted to camp like the natives and mountain bed did, and found a spot about 80 feet away to lay our sleeping bags. We tucked in a hole right under a 10-foot-high root ball that was still attached to a giant red cedar log. The hole inside the cedar tree's root system looked more like a little cave, just big enough for us to crawl in. We did the usual stuff that kids and dads do while camping: roasted hot dogs, went swimming in the lake, sat around and cooked over the campfire, went on short hikes up the creek to try fishing, and generally had a bunch of fun. We did, however, do one thing that was a little different that may have played a part in what happened. While back at our hideout, Barry and I had a long wolf howling contest on our first night there, until his dad told us to shut up and go to sleep. Although I can't for the life of me remember the sound that woke Barry and I up from a deep sleep under our log, but I do recall that it was just beginning to break day. I also remember that we both jumped up out of our sleeping bags and headed for his dad at a real quick pace. Once Barry and I got over to where his dad was sitting with his .303 British Army rifle clutched in his hands, we could plainly see he was rattled, shaking like a leaf and as white as a ghost. Even though we were kids, we both knew by looking at his dad's reaction and facial expressions that something was seriously wrong. Thinking back, when you see real fear in a grown person, it's little things like this that you can never forget. I remember that Barry and I were scared stiff after seeing his dad, but we did ask him what was wrong. He replied to us that he kept his loaded rifle aimed at a big black bear, walking continuously on its hind legs, and had been sniffing, pawing, and circling around and around the log that Barry and I were sleeping under. Now, even at this young age, Barry and I were not stupid city slickers. We both came from hunting families and knew that bears don't remain on their hind legs while walking. I clearly remember that we each gave each other a look and knew that his dad's story was pure crap. In any case, I also remember that as soon as we finished gulping down our breakfast, the first thing that Barry and I did was casually wander back over to our log hideout and search the ground for tracks. I do remember finding some big tracks, but all they were really were holes in the pea gravel where something had gone around the big root ball in circles. This story is about two mining prospectors, Canadians, who in 1965 found themselves while searching for minerals in wild mountain country at the head of Pitt Lake in BC. Ron and Lauren Welch worked for a large mining concern, and their job was to locate mineral sources as they lay claims on them for their company. The country to the north of Pitt Lake is rugged and inhospitable. Many stories have come out of the area of lost mines, impassable gorges, and of men who have gone in there and disappeared, never to be seen again. Pitt Lake itself is a body of water subject to sudden and violent storms, and it has drowned many people. Generally speaking, it is not a country for amateurs, but the Welch brothers were not amateurs. They were professional prospectors, and their knowledge of survival in the wilderness was born of many years of experience. They were not the kind of men to go into the BC wilderness unprepared, just as they were not the kind of men to imagine something like a Bigfoot. Theirs was a hard-headed approach to a profession that did not allow for flights of fancy, did not allow for very much more than hard work and plenty of it. One afternoon, they were trekking northeast close to the shores of a small lake. There was snow on the ground, and the lake was frozen. There was light timber in the area, the weather was clear, and a thin sun and no wind. They stopped to rest and have a smoke, taking off their packs and placing them against the rock. They sat for a while and were smoking and talking quietly when one of the brothers noticed a movement among the trees about 150 yards away. Both brothers looked up and saw standing and watching them a very large, hairy, dark-colored man-like figure. The figure, they said, simply stood and watched them as they gained the impression that it was just as curious about them as they were about it. The only movement that it made was with its arms, which hung down by its side. It seemed to be about 8 feet tall, very heavily built, and it also appeared to have almost no neck. It was thickly covered with hair all over, and the color was a uniform dark brown, almost black. The face seemed to be hairless, but it was difficult to see at the distance that they were. The backs of the hands also seemed to be lighter in color. They were either less hairy, or the actual hair on the back was a paler shade. The brothers kept quite still, and they say they watched the creature as it watched them for probably several minutes. Then suddenly it turned and walked away, its massive body quickly disappearing into the trees. They did not see it again, but later that day when they came back through the same area, they were nervous at the thought of meeting it again, and instead of taking the same route back, they walked out on the frozen ice and down the middle of the lake. The ice was thick enough to bear their weight, but not, they hoped, strong enough to bear the weight of whatever it was they had encountered. The next day, still working in the same area, they found a set of footprints. The prints were old and melted out to the length of 23 inches. They found a second set of 10 inches in length. The second set came and went from a small lake where there was a big hole the ice had been broken and the snow swept back. The hole was 4 or 5 feet in width and quite like another I found in northern Washington in 1971. The Welch brothers returned home and for a while kept quiet about what they had found. They knew that people would view their story with great skepticism, but it was difficult to not talk about, and after a while their story leaked out. For a few days nothing happened. Then the Vancouver Sun, a large circulation newspaper of some influence in BC, was interested. Both brothers had agreed not to talk to the media, and now a problem arose about publicity. Eventually, the persistent Vancouver Sun agreed to a compromise. If they could have the story, they would not print the brothers' names. They got their story, but their reporter who wrote it up, quite frankly, did not believe it. The brothers suggested that he fly out to the area and have a look at the footprints. Annoyed at the skepticism of the newspaper and its staff, one of the brothers offered to pay for the charter of the helicopter. The Sun agreed, and a few days later one of the Sun's reporters flew with one of the Welch brothers to the area. There he and the helicopter pilot saw the footprints. By this time they were melted out and deformed by wind and sun effect, but the reporter returned satisfied with his story and satisfied with the integrity of the two men. The Welch brothers have never returned to the area of the sighting, and to the best of my knowledge there have been no organized expeditions or searches for what they saw in those rugged ranges of the Garibaldi Mountains to the north of Pitt Lake.